Chase, eye in hand, read the letter twice before he let himself believe it was real. Miss Nell Carter, seamstress, 26 years, seeks respectable situation as wife. Plain in appearance, steady in temperament, accustomed to hard work, will travel. He folded it along its worn crease and set it on the kitchen table beside the coffee tin, the same spot where he'd set every other letter that had come through Willow Bend these past 2 months. 6 replies to his advertisement. 5 he'd already turned down. 1 wanted a house with glass windows, another asked after his standing in town, and a third had written 3 pages about her singing voice without once mentioning whether she could cook. This one was different. Short, plain. No mention of romance, no mention of love, just work, and a willingness to give it. That suited him fine. Chase, eye in hand, born Nakov to a Kairakahua mother and raised half in her camp and half in his Mexican father's cattle trade, had no more use for romance than her man had use for saddle with no horse under it. He'd loved once. Martha had given him 4 good years and a daughter with her same laugh. And then the fever had taken her. The winter on her turned too. He was not in the market for love again. He was in the market for a woman who could keep his 6-year-old fed, keep his cabin from falling into ruin around them, and not flinch every time she caught sight of his face and remembered what he was. That last part mattered more than he liked to admit. There were women in the territory who'd sooner sleep in a barn than share a roof with an Apache man. However civil, however Christian, however many cattle he ran, he'd have the door shut on him twice in Tucson just trying to buy flour. A mail-order arrangement, sight unseen, seemed the surest way around all that. By the time a woman saw his face, she'd have already agreed to stay. He looked across the room at Arna curled on the rug with her rag doll, humming some tune only she knew the words to. 6 years old, and already she asked him every night why her mama wasn't coming back, and every night he had no better answer than "She's watching over you." Hajo, Apache word for beauty, for the right way of things, the word Martyr used to whisper when she rocked their girl to sleep. Ina needed a woman in the house. Chase needed help with the cattle come spring, someone to mind the girl while he rode fence, someone steady, not glamour. Not conversation about matters he had no patience for. Steady. He picked up his pen. Miss Carter, your letter suits. I have a ranch 11 miles outside Willow Bend, Arizona territory, and a daughter of 6 years who needs tending. I will meet your stage and pay your fare. If you find the situation agreeable upon arrival, we can be married by the circuit preacher when he comes through in 3 weeks' time. I ask only honesty and hard work. I offer the same. See, eye in hand. He sent it before he could talk himself out of the plainness of it. 200 miles east, in a hotel room in Santa Fe that smelled of lamp oil and dust, and in a Whitfield read Chase eye in hand's reply by candlelight and felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in 6 weeks. A ranch. A daughter, honesty and hard work. No mention of her looks, her manners, her bloodline. No mention of Boston at all, which was exactly as it should be because Boston did not exist for her anymore. Boston was her Uncle Reginald's parlor, and the men he'd paraded through it these past 2 years since her father's death, each one assessed not for his character but for the size of the fortune he stood to gain by marrying the last Whitfield S. Boston was Silas Vance's smile across a dinner table, in a particular way her uncle's eyes went flat, and calculating whenever the Whitfield silver mine came up in conversation. The mine that was hers, by her father's will, the mine her uncle had been trying to sign over to himself for 2 years through guardianship papers and forged consent. When that failed, through a marriage he intended to arrange whether she consented or not. She had run with $400 sewn into her petticoat hem, a false name borrowed from a maid who'd once been kind to her, and a trunk that held nothing finer than 2 plain dresses and a sewing kit. Everything else, the townhouse, the mine deed, the Whitfield name itself, she had left behind like a coat too heavy to run in. Nell Carter, seamstress, She had chosen the name for its very unremarkableness. Plain in appearance, the advertisement said, and she had written it about herself with a small, grim satisfaction because for the first time in her life being unremarkable was exactly what she wanted to be. A ranch 11 miles from anywhere. A man who asked for honesty and hard work and nothing more. She wrote back that she would take the next stage west. Chapter 2 The Stage to Willow Bend. The stage rattled into Willow Bend 3 weeks later in a cloud of red dust, and Elena, now, she reminded herself, now stepped down onto the boardwalk, with her trunk and her borrowed name and a bonnet pulled low enough to shadow most of her face. She saw him before he saw her. A tall man standing apart from the loafers by the mercantile, dressed plain in denim and a battered hat. His black hair worn long and tied back, his face weathered to a deep copper by a sun she guessed had touched very little of Boston's pale gentry. He was watching the stage with the careful stillness of a man who had learned, at some cost, not to expect good things to arrive easily. "Miss Cotter," his voice was low, unhurried. "Mr. Iron," and she held out her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, surprise, she thought, that she'd offered it at all, he shook it. His grip was gentle for a hand so clearly used to hard labor, calloused across the palm, a thin white scar tracking along one knuckle. "You're smaller than I pictured," he said, not unkindly. "Just an observation, the way a man might note the weather." "I'm sturdier than I look." It was the truth, or near enough. 2 years of watching every word in her uncle's house had taught her to carry herself like glass and think like iron. He studied her a moment longer than politeness strictly required, and she wondered, with a small cold drop in her stomach, whether he could see past the plain gray dress and the sun-faded bonnet to whatever still lingered of the girl who'd once worn silk. But whatever he saw, he only nodded and reached for her trunk. "Wagons this way. Arner's with the Hendersons for the day. She's eager to meet you. Talked of nothing else all week. Arner is your daughter. 6 years old. Sharp as a tack. And twice as stubborn." For the first time, something warmed in his face, not quite a smile, but its foundation. "You'll want to know now, before we go any further, Miss Carter, that I'm half Kairakeshua Apache. My mother's people. There's some in this territory who'd think less of you for marrying a man like me. I'd rather you knew it plain, from me, than heard it whispered at you in town." He said it steadily, watching her face for the flinch she'd clearly seen before many times, from many women. Elena thought of Sealer's Vance's smooth Boston manners, his soft hands that had never done an honest day's work, the calculating warmth in his eyes whenever he looked at her and saw only a mind deed with a woman's face. She thought of her uncle's parlor, full of men exactly like him. "Mr. Einhand," she said, "I have found that the men whose company I trust the least are generally the ones the world thinks most highly of. I'll not judge you for what other people whisper." Something shifted behind his dark eyes, surprise again, and beneath it, cautious relief. "Well," he said, "that's a fair answer." He set her trunk in the wagon bed. "Climb up then. It's a long ride to the ranch, and I expect you're tired." She was tired. Tired in a way that went bone deep, that had nothing to do with the stage's jolting and everything to do with 2 years of watching her back. But as the wagon rolled out of Willow Bend and the desert opened wide and red and endless around them, she felt for the first time since her father's funeral something like the beginning of breath. Chapter 3 Arna. The ranch sat in a shallow valley below a line of red mesas, a low adobe house with a good stone chimney, a barn in decent repair, and beyond it grazing land that rolled out toward the horizon in every direction. It was not grand. It was, Lena thought, looking at it in the fading light, the most honest-looking place she had ever seen, nothing pretending to be more than it was. Arna came running out before the wagon had fully stopped, a small dark-haired girl in a patched calico dress, her father's same steady black eyes set in a face still round with childhood. "Are you the seamstress lady?" she demanded, skidding to a stop at the wagon wheel. I am. My name's Nell. Elena climbed down, careful of her skirts, and crouched to the girl's level without thinking about it, the way she might once have crouched to greet a favorite dog before her uncle's household had trained the ease out of her. And you must be Arna. Papa says you're going to marry him, and live here and help take care of me. Arna said this with the frank bluntness of a child assessing a new arrangement. Can you make a dress for my doll? She only has a flour sack. I believe I could manage that. Elena glanced up and caught Chase watching the two of them with an expression he clearly hadn't meant to be caught wearing, something unguarded, something almost like hope. He cleared his throat and busied himself with the trunk. Supper's simple. Beans and cornbread. I'm no cook. I am, Elena said. It was, in fact, one of the few true things about her the world knew. She had learned needlework and cookery both from the same defiant impulse, back when her governess despaired of her and her father, before his illness, had only laughed and said a Whitfield woman should know how to survive without servants, should the need ever come. He had meant it as a philosophy. She had not known, dying, how literally she would need to live it. That night, after Arna was asleep and the dishes were washed, Elena sat at the rough kitchen table across from Chase Iron Hand and told him the only lie she intended to tell more than once. I should say plainly, Mr. Iron Hand, that I have no family to speak of. No one will come looking for me here. And I'd rather not discuss where I've come from beyond that. I mean you no trouble by it. It's simply mine to keep. He considered this for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly between his hands. Everybody out here's running from something, Miss Carter. Whether debt, the law, grief. Half this territory's full of people who left their old names back east. He looked up at her, and there was no suspicion in it, only a kind of rough understanding. I won't pry. A person's past is their own business till they choose to share it. All I ask is you don't bring trouble down on Arna. I already have, she thought, with a small, cold twist of guilt, thinking of Sellers Vance and the $400 in the mine deed still filed under her name in a Boston callhouse. But Boston was 2,000 miles behind her, and surely, that was far enough. I won't, she said, and hated just a little how easily the lie came. Chapter 4 of the Wedding. The circuit preacher, a rail-thin man named Obadiah Pratt, came through Willow Bend 3 weeks later exactly as promised, and Chase Iron Hand and Nell Carter were married in the small clapboard church with Arna as the only guest on the bride's side and half a dozen ranch hands and neighbors filling out the grooms. Elena wore her one good dress, gray wool with a modest lace collar she'd sewn herself. In the evenings, and if it was not the silk and pearls a Whitfield wedding might once have called for, she found she did not miss them. There was something clean about a ceremony with no crowd of calculating relatives, no Sellers Vance smiling from the front pew like a man already counting his inheritance. Chase said his vows plainly, without flourish, looking at her steadily the whole while, and when the preacher pronounced them married, he did not kiss her, only took her hand and held it and said quiet enough that only she could hear, "Thank you for coming this far for a stranger and a child who needed to." "You're not strangers to me anymore," she said, and found startled that it was true. They did not share a bed that first month. He'd said as much before the wedding, in his same plain way that he wanted her to have time to know the place, know Arna, know him, before anything more was asked of her, and that a marriage built on convenience needn't rush toward intimacy. It hadn't her. She had been grateful for it, and more grateful still when the gratitude slowly, unexpectedly, began to feel like something else. He was not a talkative man, but he was an observant one. He noticed when she flinched at a raised voice in town, though he never asked why. He noticed when her hands went still and her eyes went distant of an evening, staring at nothing. Then he'd quietly find some task to draw her back, asking after a stitch pattern or having Arna bring her a wildflower to identify. He noticed and he never pried, and it was not prying that undid her. Slowly, In a way 2 years of Sealer's Vance's practiced compliments never had. Anna adored her within a fortnight. The doll got its dress, blue calico with a lace hem, and then a bonnet to match, and then Anna wanted everything she owned trimmed the same. Then Elena found herself laughing, actually laughing, over a mountain of mismatched patchwork by candlelight in a way she hadn't since her father died. "You're good with her," Chase said one evening, watching from the doorway as Elena braided Anna's hair for bed, humming some tune the girl had taught her. "She's easy to be good with. She wants so little, and gives so much." Elena tied off the braid and pressed a kiss to the crown of Anna's head, and did not notice, until she looked up, the way Chase was watching her, not with suspicion, not any longer, but with something that looked dangerously close to a man falling in love with his own convenient arrangement. Chapter 5. Roots. Spring came on hard and fast, the way it did in the territory, cattle needing branding and fences needing mending and 100 small chores that kept Chase in the saddle from dawn to dusk. Elena took over the household entirely, the garden, the henhouse, the mending for half the hands on the ranch, and found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she was good at it. Not good in the performing sense her governess had once meant, the piano recitals in the correct folk, but good in the sense that mattered out here, capable, useful, needed. She had never in her life been needed. She had been wanted, in the way a deed or a signature is wanted, but needed for her hands, her judgment, her steadiness. At 3 in the morning when Arthur woke with a fever and Chase was out on a 2-day roundup, that was new, and it settled into her like something she'd been hungry for without knowing the name of the hunger. "You're different, and when you came," Chase told her one evening in early summer as they sat on the porch watching the sun go down red and gold behind the macers. Anna was asleep inside, the cattle load somewhere in the dark, and the air smelled of sage and dust cooling after the day's heat. "Different how?" "Softer. Not weaker," he added quickly, seeing something cross her face. "Softer like a hand that stopped bracing for a blow. You came here carrying yourself like glass. Now, you don't anymore." She looked at him a long moment in the dying light. This quiet, watchful man who had never once asked her to be anything but exactly what she was, who had built her a life out of plain honesty and steady work, and had, without either of them quite meaning it, built something else alongside it. "I was carrying myself like glass," she admitted, "for a long time before I ever answered your advertisement. I don't quite know how to say why, not yet, but I will someday. I promise you that." "No hurry," he said, and reached over slow enough that she could pull away if she wished, and took her hand. She didn't pull away. That night, for the first time, she let him kiss her, gentle, unhurried, asking nothing more than what she gave freely, and lying awake afterward beside him, listening to his slow breathing and the coyotes calling somewhere out past the macers, she thought, I could tell him everything, and he would not look at me the way Sealers looked at me. He would not see my indeed. He would only see me. She meant to tell him soon. She told herself that every night for the rest of that summer, and every night, some old caution 2 years deep, bone deep, held her tongue instead. It was a mistake she would come to regret bitterly, though not for the reason she feared. Chapter 5.5. The Harvest Dance. Willow Bend held its harvest dance the first Saturday of September in the same barn the town used for weddings, funerals, and every celebration in between, and Elena spent the better part of a week telling herself she wasn't nervous about attending as Chase Ironhead's wife. She was nervous. She had seen, in 4 months of trips into town, the way certain women drew their skirts a fraction closer when Chase passed. The way certain men's greetings to them carried a coolness that had nothing to do with the weather. Sarah Henderson had warned her gently, the week before, that not everyone in Willow Bend would extend her the same welcome the Hendersons had. "Some folks around here remember the fighting years too well," Sarah said, not unkindly, weighing out a pound of coffee. "Lost skin on both sides of it, some of them. It isn't fair to hold that against a man who was a boy himself when it happened. and Chase has done more for this town than most who'd look down on him. Pulled the miller's whole herd out of a flash flood 2 winters back, near drowned doing it. But old grief doesn't always listen to fairness. Elena thought of her own 2 years under her uncle's roof, learning exactly how little fairness had to do with how a person was treated, and found she understood the shape of it better than Sarah perhaps guessed. The dance, when it came, was every bit as complicated as she'd feared and considerably more hopeful than she'd expected. There were cold looks, yes, a cluster of ranch wives near the punch table who fell silent and overly polite when Elena drew close. A man named Hollis Reed, who made a point of steering his family to the barn's far side rather than share it with Chase's. But there were more who didn't. The Hendersons claimed a table near the center and waved them over loudly. Old Tom Ferris, who ran a livery, asked Chase after a horse-breaking method. Elena gathered was something his mother's people had taught him, and listened to the answer with genuine interest rather than the polite indulgence she braced for. And when the fiddler struck up the first reel and Chase held out his hand to her in front of the whole assembled town, plain and unhurried as he did everything, she took it without a flicker of hesitation, and if a few eyes narrowed to see it, considerably more softened. "You didn't have to do that," she murmured, as he turned her through the first figure of the dance with more grace than she'd expected from a man who spent his days in a saddle. "Make a show of it. I mean." Was that a show? His hand was warm and sure at her waist. "I've spent a good part of my life being careful about what I let this town see of me, where I stand, who I claim, how much of myself I show at once. Cautious, the way you learn to be when half the room's deciding whether you belong in it. I'm tired of being cautious about you, Nell. You're my wife. I'd like the whole territory to know it plain." Arna, meanwhile, had commandeered 3 other children into some elaborate game involving the barn's hayloft ladder and was shrieking with laughter loud enough to draw indulgent smiles even from Hollis Reed's disapproving wife, and Elena thought, watching her, that there was something in a child's plain delight that even old grief found difficult to entirely resist. They stayed until the fiddler played the last reel and the lanterns burned low, and walking out to the wagon afterward, Eleanor's hand tucked into the crook of Chase's arm, she felt something settle into place that she hadn't known was still unsettled, some last quiet fear that she would always be a guest in this life rather than a true part of it. "Not everyone will come around," Chase said, helping her up onto the wagon seat, reading her thoughts with the ease he'd developed over the months. "Some won't, ever. Reed's father lost 2 brothers in the raids back in '68, and I doubt time or fairness will soften that for a man who was raised on the grief of it. But most will, given time, same as most already have. This is a good town. Under the old wounds, it just takes some of them longer to heal than others." "I'm not afraid of the wait," Elena said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that it was true. She had spent 2 years afraid of a fortune that wasn't even truly hers to fear, afraid of a name and a mine and an uncle's ambitions. A little cold politeness from strangers who didn't yet know her seemed, by comparison, a very small thing indeed to weather. The ride home was quiet and easy under a wide sky thick with stars, Arna asleep between them with her head on Elena's shoulder, and Elena thought, watching the dark shapes of the macers rise ahead against the star field, that she had never in her life felt so entirely, unremarkably, and completely happy. Chapter 6. The Stranger in Town. The man arrived in Willow Bend on a hot Tuesday in late July, riding a horse too fine for the territory and wearing a suit too fine for the heat, and asking questions of everyone he met about a young woman traveling under a false name. Elena heard of it from Sarah Henderson, who ran the mercantile and had watched Elena grow from cautious newcomer into something like a friend over the past months. "City fellow," Sarah said, counting out Elena's flour and sugar with a frown. "Slick sort. said he was looking for his cousin, run off after some family trouble, and did anybody know a Miss Whitfield, or maybe traveling under another name. Boston money, by the cut of his coat. Nobody told him anything. If it is your mind, any Willow Bend don't much care for strangers who ask more than they answer. Eleanor's blood went cold clean through. Whitfield, her true name, spoken aloud in the one place on earth she'd thought it could never follow her. Did he give his own name? Vance, I believe. Sealers. Vance. She managed to pay for her goods and thank Sarah and walk out of the mercantile with her spine straight and her steps even, and only once she was alone on the wagon seat, the reins gripped white-knuckled in her hands, did she let herself shake. 2 years he chased me across a continent, and I thought $400 and a false name would be enough. I was a fool. She had never told Chase the truth. Not the mine, not the fortune, not the uncle who had spent 2 years trying to marry her off or sign her rights away by force, whichever came easier. She had told herself it was a private grief, hers to carry alone, a kindness to spare him a trouble not his own. She saw now, with sick clarity, that it had been cowardice dressed up as kindness. She had wanted, so badly, to simply be Nell Carter's seamstress, wife, mother, and all but blood, that she had let the lie grow roots deep enough to choke the truth out entirely. And now Sealers Vance was in Willow Bend, and every day she kept silent was a day closer to Chase and honor learning the truth from a stranger's mouth instead of hers. She drove home slowly, turning it over the whole way, and found Chase in the yard, and Honor chasing chickens with the wild delight of a child who did not yet know the world could hold men like Sealers Vance in it. Now, Chase came to help her down, and one look at her face stopped him cold. What's happened? She could have waited. She could have chosen her moment, softened it to build up to it slow the way she'd meant to all summer. But there was no more time for slow. Not with Sealers Vance a day's ride away asking her true name in every store in town. I need to tell you something, she said, and I need you not to hate me before I've finished saying it. Chapter 7 The Whole Truth. They sat on the porch after Honor was put to bed, and Elena told him everything, in the plain, unflinching way she'd learned from him, no flourish, no softening, just the truth laid out complete. That her name was Elena Whitfield, only child and heir of Charles Whitfield, whose silver mine in the Colorado mountains had made the family one of the wealthiest in Boston before his death 2 years past. That her father's will had left the mine entirely to her, to be held in trust by her uncle Reginald only until she married or turned 25, whichever came first. That her uncle had spent those 2 years trying to secure the fortune for himself, first by forging her consent to sign the mine over to him directly, and when the courts balked at that, by attempting to arrange a marriage to a man of his own choosing, a man who would sign the mine's management over to Reginald as the price of the bride. That the man was Sealers Vance. That she had refused him 3 times, each refusal met with less patience than the last, until the night she overheard her uncle and Vance discussing, quite calmly, whether an unwilling bride could simply be made willing, by means that turned her stomach even now to remember. That she had run that same night, with $400 and her father's small locked strong box of mine documents sewn into her trunk lining, and a borrowed name, and had not stopped running until a plain advertisement for a mail-order wife had offered her the one thing she wanted most in all the world: to be ordinary, to be safe, to be needed for herself and nothing else. I should have told you before we married, she said, when it was finished, staring out at the dark shade of the mesas rather than at his face, unable to bear whatever she might find there. I told myself I was protecting you and Honor from a danger not yours to carry. The truth is I was protecting myself. I wanted so badly for this, for us, to be real, and not some arrangement built on my fortune or my family name, that I let the lie stand long past when it was fair to you. I am sorry, Chase. More sorry than I know how to say. The silence stretched long enough that she thought she might be sick with it. Elena, he said finally, her true name spoken for the first time, and she flinched to hear it, half expecting it to sound like an accusation. It didn't. It sounded, if anything, gentle. Look at me. She did. I married a woman who got up before dawn to salt my meat and mend my shirts and love my daughter like her own, who never once asked what my ranch was worth or what my name would buy her, who chose plain work and a hard life over whatever comfort or fortune might have bought her instead. That's who I know. A name and a mine in Colorado don't change one thing about who you've been in this house for 4 months. He took her hand, and this time there was nothing tentative in it. You should have trusted me sooner. That's a fair thing to be sorry for. But I'm not angry. Now, Alana, I'm not going anywhere. The question now is what we do about the man asking after you in town. Elena let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for 2 years. He won't stop, she said. Sealers doesn't give up what he thinks belongs to him. He'll find out I'm married, and he'll find some way to argue the marriage invalid, or press some legal claim through my uncle, or— She stopped, thinking of the cold, calculating look in Vance's eyes the night she'd overheard him. Or he'll try something uglier. He's done it before, to men who stood between him and money he wanted. Chase's jaw set in a way she'd never seen before, not the quiet patience she knew, but something harder underneath it, forged, she suspected, in years of defending what was his against a territory that had never made that easy for a man like him. Then let him come, he said. You'll find I don't scare as easy as a Boston uncle's lawyers. Chapter 8 Sealers Vance. He came 2 days later, riding up the ranch road in his fine coat gone gray with dust, flanked by 2 hired men with the flat, unhurried look of man paid to be dangerous. Chase was waiting on the porch before the horses had fully stopped, rifle broken open over his arm in a way that made clear he knew how to close it fast if the need arose. Elena stood beside him, chin up. Arner kept safely inside with Sarah Henderson, who had come out that morning on some instinct Elena suspected was not entirely coincidence. Elena. Sealers Vance swept off his hat with the same practiced grace she remembered from 100 Boston parlors, though the smile beneath it had a thinner, harder edge out here in the sun. You've led me quite a chase. I confess I didn't expect to find you. His eyes moved over the ranch, the adobe house. Chase's weathered face, with poorly hidden distaste, settled. I'm married, Sealers. Legally. Before God and the territory. Whatever business you think you have with me, you're 2 years and 2,000 miles too late. Married. Vance's smile didn't waver, but something calculating moved behind his eyes, the same look she remembered with a chill he wore the night she overheard him plotting with her uncle, to a half-breed rancher, no less. Your uncle will be delighted to hear how far the Whitfield name has fallen. He looked to Chase directly for the first time. You understand, of course, that this marriage changes nothing regarding the mine. Miss Whitfield's inheritance is bound by trust terms established in her father's will, terms that specify her uncle's continued management until she reaches 25 or marries a man of suitable standing, a clause, I should mention, that a ranch hand and his cattle are unlikely to satisfy in any caught back east. There's no such clause, Elena said, cold fury rising clean through the fear. I read that will a dozen times. It says marries, full stop. Nothing about suitable standing. The will your uncle filed with the Boston court says otherwise. Vance said smoothly. Amended quite properly after your father's passing to account for certain protective provisions. I have the documents with me. Should you care to review them? He smiled again, and this time it did not pretend to warmth. You can, of course, contest it. From here. Alone, without family, without the resources to hire proper counsel, against my attorneys and your uncle's considerable influence with the Massachusetts bench. Or you can come home with me now, quietly, and we can discuss terms that needn't destroy what little you've built for yourself out here. She's not going anywhere with you, Chase said, and there was nothing quiet in it now. Vance's eyes flicked to him with cool contempt. This isn't your concern, mister. And it's very much my concern, seeing as she's my wife and you rode onto my land making threats against her. Chase closed the rifle with a sharp, deliberate click. You said your piece. Now you will ride off it. For a moment nobody moved. Vance's two hired men shifted, hands drifting toward their belts, and Elena's heart climbed into her throat, until, from the barn and the bunkhouse, both 4 of Chase's ranch hands stepped into view, unhurried, rifles held loose but ready, the casual readiness of men who worked cattle country and knew exactly how a standoff was supposed to look. Vance's men went very still. Vance himself only smiled thinly, recalculating. There's no need for this to turn ugly, gentlemen. I'm a man of business, not violence. He settled his hat back on his head. But understand me, Elena, I did not come 2,000 miles to go home empty-handed. If you won't come willingly, I'll pursue this through the courts, and I promise you, the outcome will cost you far more than it costs me. Your uncle has patience. I've simply run short of mine. He turned his horse. I'll be in Willow Bend a week at the hotel, should you reconsider. They watched him ride out, his men falling in behind, dust rising red in the afternoon heat, until the whole party dwindled to a smudge on the horizon and then to nothing at all. He'll be back, Elena said quietly, or he'll send someone worse. Then we'll be ready, Chase said, and took her hand. Chapter 8.5 The Grandmother's Blessing. 2 days after Vance rode off toward Willow Bend, Chase told Elena they would be riding out to see his mother's people before anything else happened, before lawyers, before judges, before whatever storm was still to come. My grandmother's getting on in years, he said, saddling the horses in the gray pre-dawn light. If trouble's coming for this family, I want her blessing on it. And I want her to meet the woman I married before anything happens that might keep that from happening at all. They rode 2 hours northeast to where a small cluster of families lived along a creek bed thick with cottonwoods, out past the edge of the reservation boundary the government had drawn and redrawn more times than anyone Elena spoke to could keep straight. Chase's grandmother, a small, sharp-eyed woman named Ishkene, who had raised Chase's mother, and, after her daughter's early death, a good deal of Chase himself, received them in front of a house of mixed adobe and canvas with the same unhurried steadiness Elena had come to recognize as a family trait. So, the old woman said in careful English, studying Elena with an attention that made her feel, not unpleasantly, entirely seen. This is the wife who ran from a fortune. Word travels, Chase said, half a smile in it. Word always travels. That is the one thing that has never changed about this territory. Ishkene gestured Elena to sit and for a long moment simply looked at her, unhurried, the way Chase looked at things he meant to understand rather than merely glance past. My grandson does not choose foolishly. He did not choose his first wife foolishly. And I do not think he has chosen a second one foolishly either. But I will ask you a question. And I would like a true answer, not a polite one. I'll do my best, Elena said. When the man from your old life comes, and he will come, they always come, will you stand beside my grandson, or will you run again, back toward whatever comfort your old name can still buy you? Elena thought of Boston, of silk and pearls and a townhouse full of men who had never once asked what she actually wanted, and found the answer came without any hesitation at all. I have already run once, from a life that wanted to spend me like money rather than know me as a person. I will not run from this one. Whatever comes, I intend to stand here. Something in the old woman's face eased, not quite a smile but its close cousin. Good. She reached out and took Elena's hand in both of hers, weathered and strong despite her age, and said something in her own language, low and rhythmic, that Chase, watching, did not translate but received with visible reverence. That is a blessing for a marriage built on truth rather than convenience, she said afterward, which is the only kind worth having, whatever a marriage begins as. You came to my grandson as a stranger hiding a name. You may leave today as someone with a claim to this family's protection, if you want it. I want it, Elena said and found her eyes unexpectedly wet. They stayed through the afternoon, and Elena watched Arner run barefoot along the creek with cousins she'd apparently known her whole short life, watched Chase fall into an easy, teasing, Apache conversation with an uncle who ribbed him mercilessly about something involving a horse in his youth, watched the whole unhurried rhythm of a family that had survived a great deal worse than one Boston lawyer and still gathered, still laughed, still blessed new marriages with the same steady ceremony they always, she thought, riding home in the long gold light of early evening, Arner as sweep against Chase's chest in the saddle before him, that she had come west looking only for safety, and had found, instead, an entire family's worth of belongings she had never once let herself hope for. "Thank you," she told Chase quietly, as the ranch house came into view below the darkening macers, "for taking me to meet her, for giving me something worth fighting for that has nothing to do with money at all." "That's the only kind worth having," Chase said, echoing his grandmother without seeming to notice he had, and it was, Elena thought, entirely true. Chapter 9 A Fortune Worth Fighting For. That night, once Arner was asleep, Elena unlocked the small strumpbook she'd carried across 2,000 miles and laid its contents on the kitchen table, her father's original will, a mine deed, correspondence between her father and his lawyer establishing the trust terms exactly as she remembered them, with no clause about suitable standing anywhere in the document. "If your uncle filed an amended will," Chase said, turning the pages by lamplight with the careful attention of a man reading brand marks for a forgery, then somewhere there's a difference between what your father actually wrote and what got filed after he died. That's not a legal argument, Nell. That's a crime. Proving it from Arizona territory. Against the Boston judge my uncle's likely bore dinner for a dozen times is another matter. Maybe. But you're not alone in it anymore. He looked up at her, steady in the lamplight. There's a federal circuit judge riding through Tucson next month, Judge Abernathy, decent man. No patience for Easton money throwing its weight around out here. And I've got 4 months of bank drafts and telegrams proving you've lived here, married, keeping house, honest as daylight since July. That's not nothing, against the claim that you ran off unstable and needing protection. You'd do that? Fight this with me. Elena. He said her true name easily now, like he'd always known it. I didn't marry a fortune. I married a woman who chose plain work over comfort because she wanted something real, and built a home out of it with her own 2 hands. I'm not about to let some Boston lawyer take that from you because he's decided your worth is measured in silver. He reached across the table and closed his hand over hers, over the deed, over the whole tangled weight. The mine's yours. Always was. We'll prove it, and then you can do whatever you like with it. Sell it, keep it, give it to charity. I don't much care. What I care about is that nobody gets to decide your life for you again. Not your uncle, not Vance, not even me. Elena felt something crack open in her chest, some old locked door she'd kept shut since her father's funeral, and behind it unexpectedly, not grief but something warmer. I love you, she said, and it was the first time she'd said it plainly, without hedging, without the old careful distance. I think I have for months. I was only too frightened of what I was hiding to say it. I know, Chase said, and finally, at last, he smiled. A full smile, rare and warm, that transformed his weathered face entirely. I've loved you since you told me off for judging a man's worth by what other people whisper about him. Took me a while to admit I'd married a woman worth fighting a fortune's worth of trouble for. Turns out I had. Anyway, might as well fight for her properly. Chapter 9.5 Waiting for the Storm. The week before Vance's deadline passed slower than any Elena had known since her flight from Boston. Chase doubled the night watch without making a show of it, quietly rotating the ranch hands so two men were always awake and armed after dark, and rode into Willow Bend twice to send telegrams. One to Judge Abernathy's clerk in Tucson, laying careful groundwork for the hearing they both now expected would come whether Vance wanted it or not, and one to a lawyer in Santa Fe whose name Chase had gotten from a cattle buyer, a man reputed to have no love for Boston money and considerable skill at unpicking it in court. Elena spent the days doing what she had always done when fear threatened to swallow her whole. She worked. She reread every page of her father's original will until she could recite it, hunting for any phrase Vance's forgers might twist. She wrote out in her own hand a full account of the night she'd overheard her uncle and Vance discussing how an unwilling bride might be made willing, a document she intended, if it came to it, to swear before Judge Abernathy herself. However much the memory of that night still turned her stomach to revisit, Honor noticed the tension despite everyone's efforts to shield her from it. The way children always seem to notice more than adults gave them credit for. "Is the bad man going to take you away?" she asked one evening, small and solemn, climbing into Elena's lap without being asked, something she'd stopped doing so often as she'd grown more secure these past months and doing again now. Elena held her close, breathing in the smell of sun and dust and little girl hair, and thought carefully before she answered, the way Chase always did, never a lie, but never more truth than her child needed to carry. "He's going to try," she said honestly, "but your papa and I aren't going to let him. And even if he takes me to a courtroom, even if it's far away, I will come back to you. That I promise you completely, Anna. Nothing in this world could keep me from coming back to you and your papa. Promise. Promise. On my own mother's memory. Which is the most solemn promise I know how to make." Arner considered this with the grave seriousness of a 6-year-old weighing evidence, then nodded, apparently satisfied, and asked instead whether the doll needed a winter coat to match the coming season, and Elena found herself laughing despite everything, grateful beyond words for a child's particular gift of returning the world to its proper, smaller scale. That night, lying awake beside Chase long after Arner's breathing had gone slow and even down the hall, Elena found herself thinking not of Sealer's aunts or the mine or the courtroom to come, but of Marta, a woman whose bed she now shared, whose daughter now called her something very close to mother, whose photograph still sat on the mantel because Chase had never once suggested it should be put away. "Does it trouble you?" she asked quietly into the dark, "having me here in her place? I think of her sometimes and wonder if I've simply stepped into a space that was hers." Chase was quiet long enough that she wondered if he'd fallen asleep. Then Marta and I built something good together, and losing her near broke me. I won't pretend otherwise. But you didn't step into her place, Nell. You built your own room in this house, and in Arna's heart, and in mine one that stands next to what Marta left, not on top of it. There's room in a person for more than one kind of love, same as there's room in a house for more than one good memory. He found her hand in the dark and held it. Marta would have liked you, I think. She had no patience for cruelty either, and she'd have approved of a woman who ran 2,000 miles rather than let herself be sold to the highest bidder. Elena fell asleep to that thought, and if she dreamed of Sealer's Vance and courtrooms and the uncertain days ahead, she woke each morning steadied by the plain fact of Chase beside her and Arner's laughter down the hall, and found she could face whatever the week still held. Chapter 10 In the Judge in Tucson. Vance did not wait a week. 4 nights later, one of Chase's hands wove the house at midnight, shouting that riders had been spotted cutting fence along the north pasture, a distraction. They realized too late, meant to draw every man off the ranch house at once. Elena woke to the creak of a floorboard in the front room that had no business creaking, and by the time she'd shaken Chase awake, A shadow was already at the bedroom door. One of Vance's hired men. Come, she understood in one cold flash. Not for her, but for the strongbucks. For the documents that stood between Sealers, Vance, and a silver fortune. What followed was brief and ugly and over almost before it began. Chase came up off the bed with the speed of a man who'd spent a childhood learning to move silent and fast, and the intruder, expecting a sleeping house and an easy theft, was on the floor with the wind knocked clean out of him before he'd gotten off a single shout. Anna, woken by the noise, was found by Elena crouched safe in the wardrobe exactly where they'd taught her to go if trouble ever came calling in the night, frightened but unharmed, and fiercely proud, once the fright passed, that she remembered the drill perfectly. They tied the intruder to the porch post and rode for the sheriff at first light, and it did not take much persuading, faced with jail and a federal charge of breaking and entering, for the man to admit exactly who had paid him and for what purpose. Sealers Vance was gone from the Willow Bend Hotel by noon, riding hard for the territorial line, but a wired warrant reached Tucson before he did, and Judge Abernathy, summoned early from his circuit by Chase's urgent telegram, and Elena suspected, rather delighted at the prospect of humbling an arrogant Boston lawyer in his own courtroom, was waiting when Vance's train connection required him to change lines to the very town he'd hoped to avoid. The hearing, when it came, was almost anticlimactic after everything that led to it. Elena's original will, her father's authenticated correspondence, and 4 months of Arizona bank records established beyond argument that she was married, competent, and entitled to her inheritance exactly as her father had intended. No amended clause, no suitable standing requirement, nothing but a plain and forged document her uncle's lawyer had filed after her father's death and never expected to see contested from 2,000 miles away by a woman he'd assumed broken and biddable. Judge Abernathy did not merely rule in her favor. He referred the matter to federal prosecutors, noting with dry disapproval that attempted document fraud and conspiracy to coerce a marriage were whatever Boston society made of them still crimes under the laws of the United States. Sealers Vance did not see Boston again for the better part of 6 years. Reginald Whitfield's guardianship was stripped entire, and the mine, along with every dollar of income it had produced under his mismanagement, reverted fully and finally to Elena. Epilogue. They did not move to Boston. Elena sold the mine within the year, keeping only enough of the fortune to buy out the note on Chase's ranch entire, drill 2 new wells, and expand the herd threefold, and the rest she put, at Chase's quiet suggestion, into a trust that built a schoolhouse in Willow Bend, and funded a well for the Kirikahira families still scattered through the reservation lands nearby, families who had known Chase's mother and remembered him as a boy, and who had precious little reason, given the territory's history, to trust that any fortune moving through white hands would ever reach them honestly. You could have kept it all, Chase told her once, watching the schoolhouse race timber by timber that autumn, Arna chasing the carpenter's dog in circles around the lumber piles. Nobody would have thought less of you for it. I'd have thought less of myself. Elena slid her arm through his, watching the frame rise against the red macers, thinking of a girl who had once measured her worth by a mine deed and a family name, and who had needed to lose everything, run 2,000 miles, and answer a plain advertisement for a wife nobody wanted before she'd learned what she was actually worth. I spent 2 years being hunted for a fortune I never asked for. I'd rather spend the rest of my life building something with it that nobody can take away, not from me and not from anyone else either. Honor came running up breathless, demanding to know if the schoolhouse would have a bell and whether she'd be allowed to ring it, and Chase swung her up onto his shoulders with the same unhurried ease he did everything, and Elena watched the two of them, her family chosen and real and entirely hers, thought of the word martyr used to whisper the word Chase had taught her that first winter. Hotter. Beauty. The right way of things. Walked in balance. She had amassed a fortune in hiding, plain-dressed and false-named, running from a life that had never once asked what she wanted, She stayed for a man who had asked for nothing but honesty, and a daughter who had asked for nothing but love, and found in the asking that she had far more to give than any fortune could measure. Word of the trial reached Boston's society long before Elena ever intended it to, carried east by newspapermen who found a forged will and a disgraced guardian considerably better copy than they'd expected from a territorial courtroom, and for a season she was, whether she liked it or not, the subject of a great deal of parlor gossip she was no longer present to overhear. She found, turning the newspaper clipping Sarah Henderson mailed her over in her hands one evening on the porch, that it troubled her a good deal less than she might once have predicted. Boston's opinion of her had shaped 2 years of her life already. It had no claim on the rest of it. Ishkane came to stay with them the following spring when her own eyes had grown too dim for her to manage alone, and taught Arner to weave baskets from willow reeds with the same patient, unhurried instruction she once given Chase, and taught Elena, in her own time and her own way, a dozen small things about the land and its keeping that no Boston education had ever thought to offer. The schoolhouse opened that autumn with 40 children on its rolls, ranch families and town families, and, after some careful, patient work on Chase's part with the territorial agent, 6 children from the Creek Dead families as well. A small thing, Elena knew, against the size of all the unfairness the territory still held, but a true one, built with her own hands out of a fortune that had once nearly cost her everything. On quiet evenings when the work was done and Arner was asleep and the coyotes called somewhere out past the Macers, Chase and Elena still sat on the same porch where he'd first taken her hand, and she thought, watching the stars come up hard and bright over the red rock, that she had spent the first 26 years of her life being told what she was worth by other people's arithmetic, and had needed to lose it all, the name, the money, the easy comfortable certainty of Boston, before she'd found out what she was actually worth out here in a life built plain and honest, stitch by stitch, day by day, out of nothing but hard work and a stranger's steady kindness. It had cost her a fortune to learn it. She would not, given the choice again, have traded the lesson for anything the mind could buy. The end.